Good. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. On behalf of SAS and the Women's Initiatives Network here, I have the pleasure of introducing you to our very honored guest, Sciformix Chief Scientific Officer, Chitra Lele. Chitra has a very distinguished academic background with a PhD in statistics from Stanford University and more than 20 years' experience in the healthcare industry. In 2007, she co-founded Sciformix, a scientific process organization providing knowledge-based services to pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Prior to Sciformix, she was with Pfizer for 10 years, where she was executive director responsible for India operations of Pfizer Global R&D. Her previous experience includes work as a biostatistician in cancer epidemiology at Stanford University and University of California, San Francisco, and as a faculty member at the School of Statistics, University of Minnesota, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai. Chitra is also one of SAS's biggest ambassadors. In 1995, she secured India's first set of SAS licenses for an academic institution in India, Indian Institute of Technology. She initiated the use of SAS as part of the master's program in statistics at the Indian Institute of Technology and the University of Pune. She pioneered a global delivery model for SAS programming services, along with other services, to the pharma industry by setting up and successfully growing India's first biometric center, eventually growing it to more than 400 employees. This model was replicated by other companies in India and then other countries, including China and those in Eastern Europe. Chitra is also the founding member of the Indian Association for Statistics in Clinical Trials, a nonprofit organization established in 2007 for the statistics and SAS programming community in India, supporting the pharmaceutical industry and other healthcare organizations. And I understand that Sciformix also today employs more than 100 SAS programmers. That's huge. So she's going to take you through her journey today, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end. We do ask, since this is being recorded for our colleagues who are not able to be here with us today, we do ask if you do have a question to press and hold down your mic so the people on the webcast will be able to hear your question and she can address that. We're very honored to have you with us here today. Please join me in welcoming Chitra Lele.
Thanks, Becky, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a great honor to be here. I've been, as Becky mentioned, I've been using and promoting use of SAS for a number of years, but hadn't really visited the campus before today. So it's nice to come here and also to talk to all of you. Thanks for coming. I wasn't really, sure about the kind of exposure the audience would have, but what I'm going to try and talk about is what I know best. I understand that the life sciences industry is only one of the 24 or so industries that SAS has products in, SAS is into. But that's the industry where I've been really associated with, especially with use of SAS. So I thought I'll start with a little bit of an overview of the drug development process for those of you who are not aware, and then talk about some of my experiences in the journey and what's happening in the especially in the outsourcing space with respect to SAS and STAT for the pharma industry. So not sure if this is clearly visible to many of you, but essentially, if you look at the phases of drug development, starts with discovery of a molecule. There's some initial exploratory kind of development where the testing is done in, just in the lab and also in animals, at least 2 species of animals before it's taken for testing into humans. The initial testing in humans is also considered to be part of early development or exploratory development, which is where the testing is done only on healthy volunteers because initially we only try to look at whether the molecule, whether the drug is safe or not. So it's not about effectiveness or efficacy so much, but just about safety initially. So so some toxicity studies in animals followed by testing in humans. In the initial what we call as phase 1 trials in humans, the first in human kind of trials, the objective is to try and figure out which dose level is optimal for human consumption. So optimal from a safety perspective primarily, and the efficacy is analyzed or is assessed through what we call as pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, which is about when the drug gets into the body, what all happens in the body, and then what all happens to the drug. How does the body act on the drug and the drug act on the body? So what's the optimal time for which it continues to be in the body and circulate in the body? When does it get ejected? How? When? What's so all of that is studied through the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. And then the testing is done in patients. Initially, the studies are very small in patients because we just want to do a proof of concept of whether that particular drug at whatever dose range was determined in the previous studies has any effect at all for the indication or the disease area that is being targeted. So these are small studies which are done in patients, and the comparison is only with the placebo. So does this drug have any effect at all compared to a placebo? So that's what's tested. Also some other testing like, what's really, so in the initial studies, if it's decided that say 1 milligram to 10 milligram seems to be the range that is safe in humans, then exactly to pinpoint the right dosage. Also looking at whether there is any effect when the drug is taken before food, after food, so those kinds of studies and analysis that's done. Whether once daily dose is ideal, or whether it should be twice or thrice daily. So all of those, so different treatments in terms of dosing patterns, dosage levels need to be tested to see whether what is the effect on the disease and what is the ideal dosage. Also the formulation is tested, so whether it should be a tablet or a capsule, or whether it should be IV. So all of that is done as part of this early development, and then the drug goes into, if it's considered safe, then it goes into safe as well as if it's proven to have some effect as against a placebo, then it goes into full development where the drug is tested for efficacy against the best-in-class therapy that's currently available. So again, these are studies in patients who have that particular disease, and whatever is the currently best therapy, there may not be a single one in every region, every country. The mode of therapy can be different. The drugs used can be different, and this is especially the case in drug classes like antibiotics. Different drugs are used in different parts because of the immunity levels and so on. There are typically global clinical trials that are conducted to do this kind of testing, to test the effectiveness or the efficacy of the drug against the competition, against the other drugs. And these tend to be fairly large studies, so at least a few hundred patients typically in a study, and there can be several studies that are done. So typically the entire process from discovery to full development takes anywhere between 10 to 15 years. Typically a few thousand patients will be exposed to the drug as part of these clinical trials. And also the healthy volunteers that we mentioned before. and the rate of success is extremely tiny. You start with several thousand drugs in. I've given some statistics here. You start with several thousand drugs in the discovery phase, and only one or two actually make it all the way to submission to the regulators for approval. And so as you can imagine, in this entire process, so there is a lot of testing and analysis that's involved. So obviously a lot of statistics, a lot of programming that's involved, and this is a major area where SAS is used. When I first started doing cancer epidemiology, applying statistics to cancer epidemiology. So this was early 90s. So that's when SAS was kind of just getting used, at least in that area. And since then, the use has grown tremendously, especially in the pharma industry, because the FDA kind of quote unquote accepts the analysis that's done, the outputs that are generated, by SAS. Although there's nothing formal acceptance as such, but it's a well proven product, and so there's a certain comfort level, and everybody, all the companies, tend to use SAS for generating the analysis. There are other competing products that are also used, but they tend to get used for some of the exploratory part of the analysis. So anything that's going to be analyzed and submitted to the US FDA or the other regulators for approval, all companies will use SAS to do that analysis. So that's a little bit about the entire drug development process. The odds are pretty small. There's a lot of money. It takes about $2 billion to bring one molecule out in the market. And obviously this includes the cost of all the other 4999 molecules that don't make it, but companies still have to spend resources on ruling them out. So there has been a lot of focus on how can we rule out the molecules early, so that both in terms of speed and cost there is saving. So if we go on to the next slide, so this is a little bit about what's been happening in the industry. So I'm looking at the entire sort of period when clinical trials and clinical research started getting global. So there was more interest in looking at other geographies outside of US and EU for clinical trials. So if I look at the period from 1995, about 7-8 years, that time there was a lot of focus on how can we, the pharma industry had a lot of focus on how can we recruit patients quickly. So the rate of recruitment was very important, because given the number of years it takes, the sooner that you complete the clinical trials, either if you're going to rule out the drug or you're going to take it all the way, the better it is. So in terms of availability of patients, and especially availability of treatment naive patients, there was a lot of interest in looking at some of the emerging markets as well. And clinical trials started becoming more global, and India was the first sort of major destination for patient recruitment in clinical trials. Some of the other Asian countries also followed. There's a lot happening in Eastern Europe subsequently. But so my association with the drug development industry, pharma industry, started around this time, 1997 to be precise. Before that, I was working more in the cancer epidemiology area, not directly for pharma companies. But so around that time, as part of Pfizer, we first were focused on clinical research in terms of clinical trial recruitment in India. But then, Pfizer thought that there is such a vast talent pool available in India. The IT industry was already outsourcing by that time a fair amount. Infrastructure was, seemed promising that it would improve. It was not quite, all that good at that time, but there was promise, and especially a lot of graduates with the right kind of qualifications who were available. So we at Pfizer thought that why don't we also look at using resources in India to help with some of the data related work involved in the clinical trials. So along with recruiting patients in the trials, we also started looking at getting some of that work done. Initially, as it happens with all outsourcing, you start with very routine, process-oriented activities. Once there is some comfort level with that, you gradually move on. So that's how it happened. So we started with getting some data entry work done. At that time, the data was mostly collected on paper, the patient data. So there was data entry. And then managing the data. So there was a lot of effort in cleaning the data, in looking for writing programs to look for errors in the data, and then cleaning them, sending the queries back to the sites, getting them resolved, so all of that. So data management in general. And then we also started, as part of the Pfizer group, also started simultaneously looking at statistics and programming support for the global trials from India. So statistical design of trials, writing the analysis plans for the clinical trials, and then doing the analysis, programming all of that, and obviously all of that was in SAS. So gradually, as I mentioned, the expansion in terms of clinical trial recruitment spread to other parts of Asia and Eastern Europe, Latin America. Pretty much now a lot of trials are very global in nature. Partly also because there is recognition that ethnicity also makes a difference in terms of how the drug efficacy and how the drug works. So there is an interest in having, even if a company decides for whatever reasons that bulk of the recruitment will happen in the US, there's still a small part of recruitment that happens in some other countries. Over and above that, there is also a mandate, and now the regulations are getting more and more well defined in the emerging geographies as well. So a lot of the emerging geographies have a mandate to do a small study, 100, 200 patient study in that population and show that the drug is safe, especially from a safety perspective, not so much from an efficacy perspective, show that it's safe. Even though global data is available about the safety and the efficacy, and the drug has been approved by US FDA or by EMA, the countries still require some study to be done locally. So there's a lot of globalization of clinical trial recruitment, which has happened. I mentioned about the data entry, data management part of it. So the part of the reason was the, as I mentioned before, the labor arbitrage, but also the cost efficiencies, because things were getting harder and harder for the industry. It was taking longer to bring a drug out into the market. It was costing more and so on. So there was that cost pressure, and so there was an interest in also getting some cost efficiencies by doing it from the low cost geographies. Around 2000 or so, a couple of other companies like Novartis, Quintiles, and primarily Novartis and Quintiles, I think, also started looking at getting some of these activities done from India. Data management, programming, even for data management, SAS gets used, and programming from India. And then from 2004 onwards, it really, the trajectory looks quite different. So Pfizer decided to substantially expand its footprint in terms of support of these global trials from India. So that's when we went out and recruited more people, and also encouraged a couple of other partner companies to get into this space and help them build capability and so on. And then all of this really took off, big time. and today it's become a fairly major industry in India. And later around 2007 2008, Pfizer started operations in China. Subsequently, I mean, today most of the large pharma companies have operations in China, supporting global R&D in some way or another. For sort of, because certain activities due to language issues are not that easy to do in China, but certain activities are quite easy to do, and data management and SAS programming in particular are done a lot in China also today. So as I said, most pharma companies, but also most CROs, all the large CROs today have captive units in India. Pharma companies, some of them have captive their own, units, but others have tried various models. Some have worked for some companies, some haven't. But even if companies don't have their own captive units, through their alliance partners or through the CROs, the contract research organizations that they use, they are being supported from India with respect to data management and analysis of clinical trials. So just, I mean, to give you an idea how big is the market or is the group, I would say that there are at least about 2,000 SAS programmers in India who support clinical trials. And obviously there are others who are in other industries, especially finance. There are quite a few. But just even if you look at just clinical trials alone, and bulk of it is really phase 2, phase 3 kind of, I mean, the full development kind of trials. And that's where there are, so many programmers in India doing various tasks, but a fairly, large team, and also a large group, as I mentioned, in China. There was a lot of interest in getting programming work done from Eastern Europe. So that started again around that same period, 2004, 2005. So some countries in Eastern Europe where there were a lot of statisticians available, people qualified in statistics available. So a lot of programming work was happening from there. There's also some interest in utilizing South America, Latin America. There was actually one group that was getting some of this work done from Mexico in the early 2000s. So it's fairly global now, supporting clinical trial data management and analysis. So if we move on to the next slide. So if you look at, so this was sort of around the, how the outsourcing offshoring scene has evolved. Now, partly why it evolved, as I mentioned before, was all the pressures on the pharma industry, and I'm elaborating a little bit on those pressures here. And these have only intensified today and are expected to continue and get even more intense in the next few years, over the next few years. So the cost of drug development by 2020, it's expected that industry R&D spend will be more than $150 billion. Clinical trial services related spend out of those 150 is expected to be more than $64 billion, and a total of more than 70% of the work gets done through outsourcing. Not necessarily offshore, it could be onshore, I mean near shore, whatever terms you want to use, but a lot of outsourcing which is happening. Also partly because of the mergers and acquisitions and the need to reduce the internal FTE count and all of that. In parallel, what's also happening is the patent cliff and the dry pipeline, as we call it. So not a lot of new good drugs being discovered. So that's been an issue for the past about at least 7-8 years in the industry. So very few really good drugs. There are a lot of drugs which are now coming out which have very marginal improvement over the existing therapy. What that means is, if there is very marginal improvement on the existing therapy, the drug has to do something else which really, merits it being approved and being marketed and so on. So there is a lot of focus not just on showing that the drug is effective for the particular disease, but also to show that it is safer than the available best-in-class medications, because as we know, all drugs have some adverse effects, and or maybe even if the drug, like especially in oncology, even if the drug is not really improving the or increasing the lifespan, the we look at whether it's at least improving the quality of life of the person. So maybe the person doesn't really live for much longer by taking the new drug, but the quality of life for those 3 months or 6 months that the person lives is really better. So what this all boils down to is for the need to collect more and more data, to analyze more and more data. So today there is a lot of focus on collecting as much data as possible after the drug is out in the market. So previously, about 10 years back, 8 years back, there was a lot of focus on the data collected as part of the clinical trials. But now that's not sufficient, because you have to show all these other things to show that your drug is really different from the competition, and why should it get approved, why should people use it, why should it get reimbursed by the so that's the whole other group of stakeholders, the payer industry, the insurance industry, because of the reimbursement and so on, and they are looking more critically at what is it that this drug is really doing, how is it adding value, if this is going to cost more, why should the company really reimburse this drug. So which means there is a need to collect a lot of what we call as real world data, or what is called as health economics, outcomes research, kind of data. Some of you may be familiar with that terminology. So basically lots and lots of studies being done after the drug is out in the market. Not all of these are planned studies like clinical trials. Some of these could be just observational, some of these could be just collect all the patient records that are available with the insurance industry or with the hospitals, and just do some analysis on those to see what's actually happening in practice, in reality. So yeah, the other point I want to mention in this context is because of the pressures on the industry, they're also, and because the new drugs coming out are not necessarily, a lot of them are not really blockbuster drugs, so they don't really generate a couple of $1 billion of revenue right away as things were happening 10 years ago. So companies are also starting to look more and more at emerging markets to introduce their drugs. Previously, new drugs would get introduced in the emerging markets 10-15 years after they were launched globally in the US or in Europe. But now there is an interest in introducing them in the emerging markets maybe a year or two after they're approved by US or Europe. So that again means more data from more geographies needs to be collected and analyzed and so on. Because of this pressure on the cost and being able to rule out the drugs quickly or conclude the clinical development quickly, the complexity of the trials in terms of the study design has increased a lot. So there are a lot of, so it's not very clear cut as it used to be in the past, that you complete your phase 2 trials and then you move on to phase 3 trials. Now there are a lot of studies or designs which are called as adaptive designs. So you do a little bit of what you would have typically done in a phase 2, quickly move to a phase 3, maybe come back to a phase 2 kind of design later. And so, which again means, because of the complexity of the designs, the statistical issues become very complex. So it's not just you have one block of data and you just analyze it at the end of it. It's not like that. Companies typically take several interim looks at the data. And so those of you who are statisticians would appreciate that if you look at the data several times, then you have to somehow compensate for it in terms of the type 1, type 2, errors and so on. So the designs are becoming more complex, and hence the analysis is becoming more complex. So, the programming using SAS has also, become more complex. Although, I'm aware that SAS also, invests a lot in R&D and keeps up with what's happening and comes up with new, procedures and so on. And that certainly helps. But overall, the amount of programming that's required to be done to analyze these data also goes up because of these reasons. The last point there is personalized medicines. So a lot of genomic data getting analyzed, and so that also means additional analysis, because you have to analyze a lot of the subgroups separately. So that also adds to the complexity of the overall statistics and analysis of the clinical trials. So this is pretty much how I see the situation today and how it has evolved. So just switching gears a little bit and coming back to the Indian context, I touched upon some of this before. So I mentioned that through Pfizer I had the responsibility for starting this new sort of line of work, a line of activity in India. It helped in a very peculiar way, in the sense that when I went back to India about 20 years ago, and I first started teaching at the Indian Institute of Technology, and what was happening at that time is the computer science field was extremely attractive because there were a lot of opportunities in that area and so on. So those who, even students who did their bachelor's in statistics would opt to do a master's in computer science and eventually get into the IT industry. Eventually they would, become programmers and so on. But when we started this and this kind of area developed, and it became known to students that, there is this opportunity as well to apply statistics, we started seeing better, quote unquote, better students, smarter students opting to pursue further education, higher education in statistics. So that was kind of, another advantage of this. So as I mentioned before, the growth was fairly exponential from 2004 to 2010. There were obviously growing pains because, in 1995, and as Becky mentioned, when I tried to get the IIT Bombay, where I was working, a SAS license, get them to procure a SAS license. People hadn't heard of SAS. Said, what is it? Justify, show where all it can be used. Why should we invest in this? So, statistics and applied statistics was basically, I was kind of responsible for starting a new program in that. So it wasn't really proven. So I had to go to approach other departments, because, obviously the use of stat was not going to be, SAS was not going to be beneficial only to the math or stat department, but other departments could use it as well. And so I approached other departments, computer science and civil engineering and OR and so on, somehow convinced the director that this was a worthwhile investment, and that's how we got the first license of SAS. But then students did not know, so they had to develop some level of expertise. So including it, mandating use of SAS in the curriculum to do their assignments and all that helped. And then later on, when through Pfizer we started recruiting, then we had to invest a lot in training these statisticians on SAS programming. SAS Institute in India was offering some training programs, and even today offers. However, those are very, very generic. So the examples that are given as part of the basic training tend to be more on the manufacturing, inventory, some of those areas which students find it very hard to relate to. So we have pretty much developed our own training and modules and so on. Also, what happens is it's very important when you do the programming and the analysis and the reporting for you to understand the data. So SAS programming as a programming skill can be acquired separately, but then equally important is when you are generating an output, when you generate an output, how do you interpret that? And do you really understand what that summary analysis is telling you? So that's why, both are important, the programming part as well as the domain part of it. A lot of investment has gone over the past several years in building that competency in India. And today, as I mentioned, about at least about 2,000 is my guess, SAS programmers supporting just this area. So looking at this scenario, we also had to build an ecosystem that would really sustain, nurture, and sustain this growth in India, especially. So we started with training in clinical research, because in 1995, a lot of the doctors in India didn't really know what GCP, good clinical practice, meant. And good clinical practice is, provides the basic guidelines around how clinical research should be conducted, how clinical trials should be conducted. And this whole industry being so regulated, there is so much emphasis on documentation. And practicing doctors don't really like documentation in general. So it was slightly different to try and orient them to the needs of this whole clinical research area. So I was involved in setting up an academy for clinical excellence, which is the first clinical research training institute in India. Subsequently, there are many more that came up. In terms of SAS, as Becky mentioned, I made it mandatory for students to use it when I was teaching courses, and I was teaching even after I was part of Pfizer. So that was one way of ensuring that students, developed some understanding, some awareness of SAS. When it comes to SAS, typically licensing, pricing of licenses tends to be an issue. Affordability is an issue. So we tried, some of the industry groups sponsored SAS licenses for a couple of these colleges, universities, and that's how we developed that level of awareness and expertise. The other professional association, related association, which I have been involved in starting, is the Indian Association for Statistics in Clinical Trials, which, as Becky mentioned, is a non-profit organization. In 2007, a couple of years before that also, some of us got together. So I was leading the group at Pfizer. There was somebody who was leading it for Novartis, somebody who was leading it for BMS, somebody was doing it for GSK. By that time, all the large pharma were doing something or the other in India in that space, and they all had these people, the heads, who had studied in the US, had started PhDs in the US, had worked here for a while, and then had moved back to India. So they had an appreciation for all these things, and we got together and we said that we should form some platform, give an opportunity for the statisticians and programmers in this area to come together and to share and all that. Because at that time, there were like a few people in each organization. So that's how we set this up. It's been doing quite well. Every other year we organize an annual conference, and every year we organize a SAS programming event, which is a big hit. We get a lot of participation for that. So we have a lot of presentations that programmers, statisticians from the pharma groups in India come together and make. And so there is a lot of last couple of years we also had we had some collaboration with Fuse, which is I don't know if some of you have heard of that. It's a SAS kind of community in the pharma space. They're quite big. Started in UK and are very big in EU and in the US. This association also kind of works hand in hand with them. We've been collaborating with the DIA, the Drug Information Association in India, in some of their events. And generally have been organizing some educational workshops and some programs throughout the year. It's not for profit, so we get sponsorships also, we try to keep the registration charges minimal. We are trying to also encourage the academic community to get involved, because because even today there is a need to grow the base, grow the capability that's available, because previously, a lot of SAS programming work that was happening from India tended to be more very process driven. So, for example, if you want to understand whether the drug is safe, there are certain fixed things that you measure, no matter what the disease condition is, no matter what the drug is. So at regular intervals, you would measure blood pressure, heart rate, certain vital signs. And so the analysis of those, the basic sort of summary analysis, tends to be very standard, no matter, what drug is and what the trial is. So companies have come up with standard macros to churn out that kind of analysis. Then there was a lot of focus on standards. So companies were using different standards before. Then they all had to be mapped to CDISC, STTM, ADAM, all those standards. So again, some of the large companies wrote standard macros to do the mapping of data from one set of standards to another set of standards. And so that kind of work doesn't really require a lot of real good programming skills. The macros are there, you just pass on different input variables or whatever, however it's set up, and then you generate the output. But as things have evolved, as the space has got more mature, there is more and more work that's being done out of India and as well as China, which has to do with programming or analyzing the efficacy data. So when we talk of efficacy, for every drug and for every disease, there will be different way of measuring whether the drug is effective or not. So the variables are different. How you want to analyze could be different depending on several other factors. So there is only limited amount of standardization of programs that can happen. And this area also requires a very good therapeutic area understanding. So we see the need even now to build that sort of capability in terms of SAS programming, and actually SAS programmers who have a very good understanding of the domain. And that is really the need of the hour. With some of my large pharma company clients that I've spoken to even this time, companies that outsourced and offshored a lot of the programming work now feel that, this is not only about India, but just outsourcing in general, because the need increased so much that a lot of the programmers who are in the industry today do not have a statistics background. They, some of them of course have an interest and learn, but in general, they don't have the basic sort of training to be able to understand the data and interpret the data and know if there is an output that the program has generated, to know that it's wrong, that it doesn't make sense, that it should not be submitted to the regulators or to the client. So there is more, focus on part of the pharma companies even here to see how there can be a blend of stat and or domain, stat as well as some therapeutic area understanding, medical sort of knowledge, and SAS programming. So that's where I think we are headed in this industry, to have to build capability of SAS programmers who are not just good at programming, but also know exactly what they are programming for, what the output means, and so on. So given that, we are also, as part of ISCT, we are trying to kind of tailor what we do more and more towards that in terms of the training that we provide, the programs. A lot of stat workshops also that we arrange, which some of the programmers attend. The programming presentations, mostly focus on how people are using SAS. Certain atypical data sets and case studies of how certain SAS procedures can be applied to those data and so on. So that's overall in terms of the ecosystem. this is, and I'll be happy to, get into a discussion on a lot of what I've said. This is my last slide. I just wanted to mention very briefly about my company, Sciformix. We started the company, we started operations in 2007. Last week we completed 9 years. They're close to about 1,000 today, about 960 or so people in the company. We set it up in a way that we wanted to focus on all the data related aspects, but with an understanding of the domain. So that's how we have recruited the people and trained them and so on. So hence we call ourselves, one of our clients once said that, why don't you call yourself a scientific process organization? This is as against a BPO, business process organization, or a knowledge process organization. So we started calling ourselves an SPO. But the point is that we try to make sure that we have enough of that domain while we are carrying out all these activities. In addition to all the data management, statistics, programming, and then a lot of medical writing comes with it, because everything that you analyze has to be reported. So we have a fairly large medical writing group also, and they also need to have they need to be able to understand the outputs that are generated by the statisticians or the programmers from SAS and so on. The other big area that we are into is called pharmacovigilance or drug safety. That's an area which has really exploded and exponentially grown since about 2005. In 2004, there was a major drug withdrawal. Vioxx, which was a Merck drug, was withdrawn because of safety issues that came up after the drug was in the market. So from that time onwards, companies started looking at safety data on drugs very, very seriously. The regulations have evolved. It's mandatory for companies to have a system in place to be able to capture the adverse effects from the drugs. So patients, their doctors, pharmacists can call into the toll-free number and report if there is any adverse reaction. So that every event has to be analyzed from a medical perspective. And we have to determine whether it could have happened because of the drug or because of any other concomitant conditions, whether there were other drugs being taken along with it and so on. So all that analysis is what we do, and then eventually those reports are submitted to the regulators. We do this on behalf of our clients, which requires us to have a lot of medical doctors also on our rolls. But the other part which is of interest to this audience is that so much data is being collected now, more and more data is being collected. So there is also, it's also important to look at the data at an aggregate level and to see what patterns emerge from the data. So when you submitted your drug for approval through the clinical trial data, you knew that there were certain, maybe 4 different adverse effects which were commonly seen. So you put that as a label, as a warning on the drug label. So people know when they're taking the drug that there are these, we keep seeing all of those on the TV ads all the time. So that is done. But then but the drug is tested as part of the clinical development process in a very controlled environment. Although there are patients, we recruit patients who don't have too many complications, too many other medical conditions. They're not taking other drugs which may have some impact and so on. But once the drug is out in the market, it's consumed by a much larger population, and a lot of the adverse effects which you cannot see during the clinical trials because it's only a few thousand patients and it's only limited usage. So some of those could be seen only with long-term usage or when the general population starts taking the drugs. So we have to look at all the data, safety data at an aggregate level, and try to look for patterns or what we call as signals. So there's this whole area of signal detection, which is essentially pattern sort of recognition kind of area, where we look for trends, and then based on that, companies decide whether they negotiate or they discuss with the regulators and decide whether a new adverse indication needs to be added to the label of the drug. So that's also an area where there's a lot of application of analytics. So I think I think I'll probably stop here, and open up for discussions.
How closely do you work with SAS R&D in India?
Um, yeah. Actually, so we have, as part of this Indian Association of Statistics in Clinical Trials, we have approached them to support the, the organization. So there are some discussions that are going on now. So far, there hasn't been anything happening from that perspective.
It's very fascinating to see the use of SAS within this area and in other areas too. And I see that you've been doing a lot of work trying to promote the teaching of SAS. So that's one of the areas where I was wondering how much could SAS R&D or the global education practice in India help you with that. So that might be something we follow
Yes,
up
yes, that's
on.
certainly something, and I am actually in discussion with the head of the SAS Development Center in Pune. Um, but so far, I mean, all these years, there hasn't been much happening. We had approached them in the past, but I think because there's hardly anything related to the pharma space that happens in that India Development Center. I think that's why that, you know, I think that interest wasn't there. But yeah, I mean, it will be very useful and very welcome. I think mutually, it will be good to have the SAS group in India collaborate on some of these areas, and also SAS user groups. Having some of those happen in India, because there is a decent sized community, and the groups are mostly situated in Mumbai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, pretty much those cities. So we also tend to do most of the events there because it's easier for people to attend. So it's not like too distributed that we can't bring people together for that kind of a forum. So it would be very useful, yeah.
So now that you're no longer associated with or full-time at IIT, who's following that up? Is there still as much of an interest in teaching SAS?
Um, Unfortunately not. Partly um, because of my background and my exposure, kind of I knew that this was important, but the faculty who are there typically tend to come from more theoretical sort of background, or there are a couple who are interested in this, but it's not in both the universities where I started. It's not happening the way it should be. Yes, the licenses are sometimes not renewed, and but then there are so many I mean other means that people have to get trained on SAS, and a lot of people tend to write these the base SAS exams, the certifications, and, yeah.
Okay. So I have a personal question. Just based on your success, you're out there as a female in technology and STEM. We're always trying to motivate ourselves and others in terms of getting interested. I'd like to know, what do you think has been the key to your success?
I think I think part of it has been the opportunity. I think I was at the right place at the right time, and got and decided to take it up, and hence got the chance of building this whole area um, of services in India, and capabilities. Um, but I think I always find it difficult to answer this question, but I think it's really your understanding of the domain. I think, and I mean, what you bring to the table is what you get respected for, and based on that, you tend to get better opportunities. So I think that's about it. When I was at Pfizer, I mean, we had an executive committee. And Pfizer in India is mostly, I mean, all the pharma companies in these countries, they're mostly about the commercial operations. So it's more of marketing and finance and all of that. And I was the only female as part of that leadership team. But somehow, I mean, maybe it was the people, the company culture, whatever. But I always got a lot of respect, so I never felt at any kind of a disadvantage. I mean, from my side, I think because I was doing things right, I was doing things well, and I understood what I was doing. I think that that helped them, respect.
Yeah, my question was somewhat technical. So how personalized is personalized medicine, and how do you test that it works?
So, I mean, honestly, we are still not there. I mean, there's a lot of talk happening around it, and I mean, there is obviously a lot of potential, but personalized in terms of what is your gene makeup, genotype. I mean, there's some testing that can be done for that. Certain proteins work in with certain genes, interact, and so to that extent, there is some level of screening that can be done. We can tell today for certain disease areas, for certain types, certain drug classes, that if you test for your some markers, some genes, and then you can pretty much rule out. You can say that this drug is not going to work, or this drug is more likely to work. But it's not like really at a personal level, but at that level. But there's a lot of you're right that there's a because you can conclude something only when you have large amounts of data, right? I mean, have like really good robust inference only when you have large amounts of data. But these samples tend to be fairly small. But at least as part of the clinical trials, a lot of such testing is happening. So the data is being generated, and at least retrospectively, companies can analyze and kind of try to figure out why some patients may not have shown any efficacy to certain drugs.
Thank you. If you could have greater in the industry that you're in, what would that be?
So I think, I mean, based on my experience, and although there is a lot of, especially in the areas of big data as they relate to this kind of data, and standards and data integration and all of that. I mean, I know that SAS has some products in that area, but what I've seen happening in the industry is that there's still a lot of manual effort, a lot of programming that has to be done despite all that. Now from from Jan 2017, the FDA has mandated that all the submissions have to be in the CDISC standards. So there's a lot of scramble for how to do that kind of mapping into those standards in a fairly automated way. I know SAS has a product in that. I have not personally seen it, but all the companies are still struggling to figure out how best to do it. What are some ways to automate that? So that, as well as the big data analytics part, because it requires data integration. When I mentioned about the health economics outcomes research data, real world data, the data is coming from so many disparate sources that the data integration itself is a huge effort. And I mean, SAS is known for its good database sort of management capabilities. So I see from what I have seen, I think that there is more development in that area that could help the industry. Thank you. Thank you very much for patient listening and for coming here. Thanks.